Hi, I'm Jamin V, and I've been working on developing a game for the past couple months, and I thought it'd be fun to do a devlog and talk about the project and my experience so far. So the game I'm working on is like a farming factory game. So it's kind of like a mix between like Stardew Valley and Factorio. So it's like a farming economy kind of game, but you can also add a lot of automation. And so far, I think it's turning out to be a pretty fun game, although it isn't actually the game I first started developing. I had actually been bouncing around an idea in my head for a really long time of like having a city and you've got little people that you collect resources in the nearby area, you bring them back to the village, and then you build more stuff and you expand your city from there, and then you expand out to other cities in order to gather more resources and stuff like that. I started prototyping that game out, so I was just kind of like testing out the ideas, trying to see if I could make it fun. And I was kind of like stuck. It just didn't seem to be working the way I wanted it to. So I was having trouble differentiating it from other games in the same space. There's a lot of other games that are kind of like that, and I wanted to make sure that mine was at least a little bit different. And so one of the elements I was thinking was that you like had to get like food and water for your people, and if you didn't, then they would eventually die. But like I was testing it out, and it really just felt like a nuisance mechanic. Like maybe it'd be fun and interesting in the early games, but then by the late game, it's just something that's just like annoying from time to time. Just like, oh yeah, I gotta give these stupid people some food. It just didn't seem like it was very fun, and so like I just kind of petered out on that idea. I spent about 2 weeks working on that prototype, and this is in my free time. Like, I work a full time job, so 2 weeks of development is like maybe 8 to 12 hours of actually my time. So, it didn't take me too long. I was using Unity. One of the great things about Unity and any of the other development platforms that we have these days is that you can jump in and you can start prototyping really, really quickly. Like, I had something working in the first hour or two. And then, like I just expanded on the idea a little bit from there until I decided I wasn't really feeling it. And so I had a few other game ideas that were bouncing around in my head, and I asked a few people what they thought was the most interesting, and everybody seemed to latch on to the idea of the farming factory game. So that's where I am. And so I've been prototyping this one out. It's got a lot of mechanics, so it's taken me a while, but so far it does seem like the elements I've added so far are definitely very fun. Being able to place blocks on the world and build conveyor belts and stuff like that, that all seems really fun. So I think I've got something there. Who knows if it'll end up working out the way I want it to, but that's kind of the idea of prototyping. You want to test things out, see if they work. If they don't, you can be really, really flexible and you can, shift and change your course. But I definitely think there's something there. So the time I spent working on my first prototype wasn't a total waste. I mean, for one, I learned how to use Unity. I have never used Unity before working on this project, so that was a big part of that first 8 to 12 hours was learning how to use Unity in the first place. And another part of it was building the camera for that game, and that is still the same camera that I'm still using today. I followed a great tutorial online. I will post a link down in the description if you're interested in the kind of top-down camera view. It does a really great job of covering how that works. I made a few small tweaks, but for the most part, I just follow that to the letter, and that's still the camera I'm using, and it works great. And so by the time I moved over into my other game, I still had a great camera that worked fine, and I didn't have to redevelop that. So the next thing that I knew that I wanted was a grid system. Now, ideally, when you're actually playing the game, you'd probably play it most of the time with the grid off, and then you might turn it on from time to time. So I definitely wanted to have that available, but it's much more important during debugging because it gives me a sense of scale. Right now, I just have a giant green plane as my ground. I haven't put a lot of effort into trying to make some diversity, adding some trees, adding some grass, something to give it a sense of scale. The grid is really important for establishing that sense of scale, and it also helps you make sure that blocks are being aligned properly, know which blocks are neighbors of each other, and everything like that. Having the grid during development was really, really important, and it was one of the next things that I built. However, I've had a lot of trouble with it. Now, you can simply just draw lines, but that's actually pretty slow. The faster way to do it is to use a shader. Now, a shader is kind of like a texture that's computed on the fly. So that's a really rough description, but it kind of is what it is. It's like a texture, but you're running code. And more importantly, that code is running on the graphics card. Now, before I worked on this project, I have never worked with shaders before. Shaders were kind of a new concept to me, and shaders have their own different language, and I didn't know that language, and I didn't really know where to start. I was able to find a couple of shaders online that did close to what I wanted. One of them did almost exactly what I wanted, but it had this weird flickering effect. And the other one was really close to what I wanted, but not quite. But it didn't have the flickering effect, but it did have some like aliasing that would happen from time to time. And so that was a little less than ideal. But I used that for quite a long time until very, very recently when I changed my grid from 100 by 100 to 128 by 128 in order to make math, division by 2, a lot easier. And so that grid was actually set up to be like a 1 to 100, and it was misaligned to the 128 by 128. And I couldn't figure out a way to get it misaligned. I spent a long time actually working both of the shaders, trying to fix the various issues, but like working on somebody else's code, even when it's like, only a page long, it's really hard to see what it's doing. It's really hard to debug shaders. I eventually just sat down one day and I wrote a shader. I wrote my first shader. It only took me a few hours. It actually was relatively easy, especially compared to trying to fix somebody else's shader. It was a lot easier. So I actually figured out in the process of building my own shader why the other one was flickering, and that's actually a pretty easy fix. It's just that they forgot to set a setting on the thing to tell it to render things in the correct order. And so things were actually being rendered out of order. And so that was an easy fix, but by the time I had gotten there, I was already halfway through coding my own shader, and I was like, I can actually make it do whatever I want because it's my shader, and it's a lot easier to do it that way. So I figured out that I could both set the setting for how thin each line is and also the alpha component of each line so that I can actually get rid of the aliasing, because as you get further away, the lines get smaller, but instead I actually make them a little bit thicker, but I give them an alpha component that's lower, so it looks like the line is the same line, but it's actually gotten thicker, but more transparent. And it's a cool effect because it just gets rid of the aliasing, basically. There's no visible aliasing. That's one of the most recent things that I worked on, was actually building out that shader. And I think it works great. I put it off for a long time because I didn't know how to work with shaders, but you learn. And I watched a few videos. I put another one up in the description. It's like 4 hours long, but it's really cool. If you want to learn how to make shaders, she does a really good job of explaining the basics of how to work with a shader. Just a fantastic job. So that helped me out a lot. So normally when working on like a farming game, the first thing you'd think would probably, let's make some crops. However, I got kind of inspired and I made a bunch of 3D low polygon animals. And so I decided, let's start with animals. And so the thing I needed with the animals was I needed a way to pin them in. I needed you to be able to set an area that's an animal pin, and you put your animals inside of that. And I wanted the fence to cover the outside of that area. That was a little bit difficult, but what I did was I looked at how Unity has what's called rule tiles. This is what it does for its 2D environment, where when you place down a tile, it'll actually pick the tile based on what neighbors are around it. And I basically just took that idea and stole it. And I made it work with 3Ds. I haven't fully fleshed it out because there are a lot of rules that are required for handling one wide animal pens. And I haven't designed those out yet. But for the most part, you can see that it's working. And so I've moved on to other things. The next thing I worked on was the animals themselves. So you can actually place the animal in the world. And then after a short amount of time, it will have a drop. And it's got the nice little dialogue that pops up that tells you that it's got a drop. And if you click on it, it'll collect the item. And I actually even built out an inventory. So the item will actually go into your inventory. and you have items. You can't actually do anything with your inventory at all. It just tells you that you've collected them. That's something I still need to build out, but it's cool that you can actually collect the items. I do also have a barn that you can place. It's just a building that can only be placed inside the animal pen. The idea is that eventually any animals in that thing, instead of having the little icon above their head, anytime they drop a thing, it'll go into the barn so that you can use the automation on the barn to collect the items from that barn and then move them off into somewhere else. Haven't set that up yet, but you can place the barn. It doesn't do anything yet, but that's something that I plan to do at some point in the near future. So then finally, I did actually work on crops, and the first thing I needed to set up was you to be able to actually till farmland. And so that works a lot like the animal pen, except it doesn't have all those special tile rules, but you select an area, and that's now farmland. And I wanted to look like the kind of rolling plantation kind of thing that you see from time to time. I thought that'd be a cool look for it, and it gives it a nice texture. And I tested it out with actual a 3D grid, and it didn't look quite right. And so what I actually ended up doing was I used a pixel art texture, 16 pixels by 16 pixels, and then I actually hand drew a normal map. So you can actually make a normal map that makes it look like it's sloped like that. I think it looks great. The illusion does fall apart a little bit. If you look in the very, very corner, if you zoom way in, you can actually see that it's a flat terrain, but from a distance, you won't notice that. And I think it looks really good. So then I had to model out I started with a carrot for whatever reason. I just decided carrot. So I had to make the crop in several different stages, and I wanted to advance from each stage after a certain amount of time. And then finally it's ready to pick, and then you get the carrot item. That actually worked really great. I didn't have much trouble setting that up at all. It just kind of replaces one mesh with another one, and it looks kind of flawless. Don't have watering on the crops yet, don't have feeding on the animals yet. Those are things that I plan to have at some point in the future. Haven't built that out yet, but the crops work. One thing that I did do that didn't look quite right if all the seeds were exactly placed in the same way. So I just applied a random rotation to each of the crops as you place them, and that worked great. I think it looks pretty good. So I had the basics of the farming down at that point. So I decided that was enough for the prototyping for now. We'll work on the watering and the animal feeding for now. I wanted to work on the actual automation. And I spent about a week working on the claw arm that I haven't even actually totally added to the game yet. But I think it's worth it. I think it's one of the assets that it's going to have the biggest effect on the game. And I might even end up using it in the splash screen. But I was also learning a lot. I needed to rig the claw arm so that it moved in the proper way, and so that the two arms of the claw closed and opened together, but closed and opened in the proper way. And so that took a lot of learning. And so it took some time. It took some time to figure out all this stuff, but I think it looks great. And I think it's a really cool asset to have. And even if I don't end up using it in this game for some reason, I'm definitely going to find a way to use it somewhere, because I think it's a cool looking claw arm. And then next, I needed to figure out the conveyor belts. And graphically, that was actually pretty difficult. Doing the graphic for the actual conveyor belt, not super hard. This was done with the surface shader, the moving effect of the thing. So it actually just moves the texture. And it's a cool effect. And it's very efficient. It almost costs nothing on the GPU. The trouble was doing it around a corner. Initially, I had this texture that had these grid lines that made it look like it was an overlapping kind of belt. And that didn't end up working because if you did it around a corner, it would pinch in the corner and it didn't look very good. And so I decided to drop that and go with just arrows because I think they look all right. I did have some trouble. You actually have to have enough polygons going around the corner in order for the texture to not get all warped. And it still does get warped a little bit, but there's not much I can do about that. If I really decide at some point in the future that I don't like that, I would actually probably build out a 3D model of the overlapping conveyor belt, but that's a lot more difficult. So for now, especially for prototype, this looks fine. I think it looks pretty good. and I think it's pretty close to what I'm going to end up using in the final game. So once I got the conveyor belt, like the actual design worked out, I actually needed to figure out how I would actually place them in the world. Like obviously, you don't want to have to manually put down every corner. You want to just place conveyor belts in the direction you want them to face, and you want the game to be smart about picking the right tile. So that's a lot like the rule tiles that I set up in the animal pen, but with one important distinction. It's actually important that it know which direction it's facing. So I actually just add a little code to the rule tile, and I have this thing called rotation relative. So if the rule tile is rotation relative, then the little box that you see in the rules, that is actually as though it were facing north. So if it's actually facing east, then that whole rule tile just gets rotated by 90 degrees. And it actually just does all that internally. And the other part of it is that we're not really interested in whether or not the neighbor is the same tile, because they could be parallel. You could have just a stream of belts and they're all pointing in the same direction. They'll never touch each other. And so those are all just straight belts. You actually are more interested in if the tiles around it are pointing in towards it. And there's one extra exception on top of that. The one in front of it, you want to know if that one's pointing, or if there is one, period. Because you don't care which direction that one's facing. That's for me to be able to do dead ends and stuff like that. So that's a lot of complicated rules, but I just basically just built it all into the rule tile. And it's fairly easy to set up the rule tiles. There's not even that many of them. And you don't have to think about, like, what if it's facing this way? What if it's facing this way? You just build it as though it's pointing north, and then the game does all the math internally. It's just, standard 3D rotation kind of math. It was a little tricky to figure it all out, but I got it working fairly easy. And so now I've got rule tiles set up for the conveyor belts. I do need to add a few more for like dead end turns, because right now I don't have anything where you've turned it to the right, but then there's nothing in front of that. I need to fix that at some point. I haven't actually designed out that mesh yet because I didn't think about it. And then on top of that, I have a special tool builder for the conveyor belts that when you click down and drag, it'll actually just follow your mouse. There are a few small things that I'd like to improve with that. If you go too fast, it'll just like skip over ones. So I might want to have it like interpolate and try and not skip any of those ones. And also I'd like to give it some resistance. It's really easy to accidentally go up one tile and then it ends up a little bit wonky. So I want you to not as soon as you go above that tile, but a little bit, you got to go a little bit past it in order to actually go up. I think that'll feel pretty natural. So those are improvements I want to put on it in some point in the future. But for now, it works fine. And I needed to focus on getting actual items moving on the conveyor belt. And that ended up being pretty tricky. Oh my God. I knew that conveyors would be a challenge, but they have been an intense challenge. I've spent quite a while trying to get the belts to work. One of the tricks of working with conveyor belts is that you want them to process items in the right order. So if it starts in the middle of a belt and it tries to move an object forward, but there's already an object there, nothing will happen. And then later in the frame, that object will move forward, but then this one will stay because it's already checked for that thing. And so you have this skittering, jumpy movement. And so you don't want that. So you want it to always start at the start of the belt and then run backwards. However, what do you do if you have a loop? Well, then it gets a little complicated. Where do you even pick the start? And so that was the first thing that I had to figure out, was how to pick a starting point. When it comes up and hits a loop, it goes through the entire belt and checks to see if there is a starting point on the entire belt. And if there isn't, it just says, okay, the one that you just placed, that's the starting point. And so I've actually got some gizmos set up to actually show me which one's the starter. So the blue one is the starter, the red ones are all normal ones, and then the lines between them show the connections between all the things so that you know that they're all pointing into each other. So it's an arbitrary starting point. So it doesn't really matter if on a loop, you just have to make sure that there's one and only one, because if you've got more than one, it's going to process all of the conveyor belts twice per tick, which is both expensive and it'll make the items move faster than you want them to and not very fluid. You don't want that. I actually had quite a few bugs where it was processing twice per tick. And then where I had the most amount of trouble was with getting the animation smooth. Just getting the timing right of everything so that it's nice and smooth, there's no stuttering, there's no skipping. I have had so many stutter and skip bugs. I think I've gotten rid of them all. I really hope I've gotten rid of them all. But the other thing I had to do, because I was still getting some bugs, is I needed to make sure that every conveyor belt operated on the same time. So what they do is there's just a global timer that operates 8 times per second. It's a setting, I can change it. 4 times per second if you're a medium belt and twice per second if you're a slow belt. But what's important is that every conveyor belt in the world be on the same time, because what would happen is I would set up a conveyor belt and then I would place another conveyor belt pointing into it, and that would actually change the timing. So I needed to make sure that it never changed the timing, that nothing you did could ever change the timing of all the belts. And, it's better that they all move at exactly the same time anyways. I think that looks a lot better if all the belts in the whole world just operate on the same clock. I have another global clock for all the regular ticks, but I have one specifically for conveyor belts that makes sure that they all operate on exactly the same time. There are still a few more things that I'd like to do with a conveyor belt. The texture doesn't quite move at the same speed as the crate does, and it'd be nice if it did. The way it moves around corners is a little weird. I might actually want to have the crate rotate as it moves around corners. And then I might want to have the texture on the belt stop if the belt is full, because it looks a little weird if the objects on the belt aren't moving, but the belt itself is moving. It definitely looks very strange. But for the most part, the conveyor belts are working. Those are nice to haves that'll probably fill out at some point in the future, but I think I'm ready to move on to the next steps. I think probably one of the next things I'm going to work on is starting with the claw arms. Right now, for debugging, I just click on a conveyor belt and it creates a crate on that conveyor belt, and that allows me to test out the conveyor belt. But I probably need to actually get that barn working so that I can get inventory into an actual world block, and then I can use the claw arm to pull inventory out of that and put it on a belt. The other thing I'm going to need to do is set up like processing buildings. So like you need to be able to mill your wheat. You need to be able, combine things, So that's the end goal, is you build up big processing plants. And then you just sell your stuff off to the market, make more money to be able to expand your farm. That's how all these games work. So then I'm probably going to want to prototype the economy out as quickly as possible, just to make sure that I'm headed in the right direction with the ideas I have about the economy. So still ways to go, but I think I've accomplished a lot. I think it's worth adding that I do have some sounds that are built into the game. I didn't want to make sounds an afterthought, because it actually is really important that you have nice gratifying sounds when you place down objects. A lot of the sounds I've made so far are probably placeholders. There are a couple that I do like. There was one that I made from opening a lid in our house. I just have like this suction lid, and I opened it and closed it, and it made these cool sounds. I think I'm using one of those for the conveyor belt, and it sounds pretty good. I did another sound by pounding on my desk, and it gave a nice woody thud, and I'm using that for the barn and a couple other things, and I might end up using that for at least something at some point in time. And then I've got like a gravelly sound. I actually went outside and used a small shovel and recorded the sound as I was digging up dirt, and I'm using that when I place seeds, but it's a little strange when the sounds overlap each other. It sounds a little weird, and so there's something that probably needs to be tweaked there. But I do like the sound itself. I think it sounds good. The chicken, on the other hand, I just recorded myself clucking and tried to edit it as much as possible to make it sound like it wasn't a person clucking, and it's a ridiculous sound, and it needs to go sooner than later. But like I said, I didn't want sounds to be an afterthought. I wanted them to be a part of the game from the beginning, and then I can always swap out the sounds later, but I didn't want to have to like try to find all these places to add the sounds into the programming. I wanted to build them in originally, and then like I said, I can swap out the sounds later. There are a lot of things that I have skipped over and glossed over. I mean, it's hard. I wanted to keep this video kind of short, and I haven't exactly succeeded at that. You know, I think I covered the important details. I think I've shown the project and what it's taken so far, talked about some of the more interesting elements of the development. So let me know what you think of my games so far. I will not be doing devlogs super often. My goal is about once a month. But, you know, if I've got a lot of things to talk about, I might do them sooner. And if there's not a lot of development, I will not do them every month. But, yeah, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.